Hello, everyone, and welcome back. And I'm absolutely honored today, on behalf of Learning Curve, to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Mark Greenberg. I'm not really going to go through all of his accomplishments, which will then take away most of the time for the keynote. So I'm going to try and keep that simple. Our connect with Mark, I think, almost started 2 or 3 years ago. And since then, we've not only kept in touch, but Mark has been very instrumental, I think, in offering several perspectives on our program, helping us shape it. And certainly in the last few months, his insights have really shaped our program quite well. And I think his credentials are as impressive as it gets. But I think for me, what's more impressive than anything else is his keenness to help other organizations, to help other people who are in the field, who are in the domain, openly share knowledge, and a humility, I think, that comes only with that sort of experience. So Mark, I can't say much more. I'm going to go hand over the floor to you. And Mark's talking to us today about how systemic SEL is a critical need in education today. Mark, the floor is all yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Subbu. And, let's see. Of course, just when I want it to happen, let me just begin by saying that I'm excited to be here with you all and to celebrate enabling spaces and the Learning Curve Foundation. I have never been to Hyderabad, and I look forward to it sometime in the future.
Okay.
Aha, here we are. Okay, great. So good morning to everyone in India, but I see there are people from Singapore and Ghana and the UK, so it's a very international group. And Molly, of course, who's going to follow me, is here. Nemo from Los Angeles. So I think SEL is a very international concept, and here we are doing international work. So what I'm going to try to do is plant a couple seeds in Nemo's terms today and talk about a little bit about the current status of social emotional learning research and practice. I think that the crisis of teaching and what we can learn and what's the pathway to create these caring, compassionate schools that we're all yearning for. So I hope I'll address two questions today. What is the evidence that SEL is effective? And I won't belabor the research, I hope. And then what is systemic SEL? What does it mean to be systemic? And how is, I think, the Learning Curve Foundation and the Accelerate work they're doing so important to improve education and community well-being? So let me just start by saying, what is SEL? And you probably know that I'm a founder of CASEL in Chicago, and CASEL has just revised its definition a bit, that SEL is the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply, notice it's children and adults, the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And when you look at the definition, there may be different ones of you who are on this call that that certain parts of this definition resonate more than others, and I think that's pretty natural. That definition comes from CASEL. CASEL is a collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning, and I've been involved in CASEL since its origin about 26 years ago. And the goal of CASEL is not about a curriculum itself, but how to advance the science of SEL, how to expand effective practice in schools and communities, and how to improve policies. And it began with a 1997 book that we call SEL 101 that defined the field. And more recently, of course, we just edited a large handbook on social emotional learning with many chapters. So SEL can be thought about as having at least these 5 sets of skills. Those that are in the red are those that are interpersonal skills inside oneself, including managing one's emotions and achieving goals and recognizing one's emotions and strengths and attitudes. The aspects in the blue have to do with our interpersonal relations, our relations with others, that I think Nemo would summarize as love. but it includes other skills in addition, showing understanding and empathy, building citizenship through our engagement socially, forming positive relationships. As we know that we're craziest in our closest relationships, aren't we? That's what Dostoevsky said. And therefore, being able to manage conflict, repair problems when you've had a fight with a friend or a spouse. These are critical skills. It's not just about getting along. And then lastly, we need to wrap all this in responsible decision making. And that means we need to have a sense of an ethical grounding that allows us to make the kind of constructive choices that will improve the quality of life, not only for ourselves, but for others. You may know Fred Rogers, some of you, that in India, I'm not sure how many, but he's a famous American who led a television show for young children. And he said, there is no normal life that is free of pain. It's the very wrestling with our problems that can be the impetus for growth. That also sounds like a very Hindu or Buddhist statement in my mind. And that's the essence here, is that we need to think about how it is that we don't avoid problems, but instead we face them and face them with honesty and kindness. So there's a lot of research on SEL, well over 1,000 randomized trials and quasi-experimental trials at this point. There was a well-known meta-analysis done in 2011 that had 213 studies, as you see, and about 270,000 students. And it showed, of course, what you'd expect. What we'd hope is that if you do social emotional learning well in the classroom, it improves social emotional skills. It improves the positive attitudes about self and other. It leads to better classroom behavior, which is important, and in that respect also to better attention in the classroom. And that's probably why it explains that it leads to an 11 percentile point gain in standardized achievement tests. It's not by magic. Children who feel connected, who feel cared for, are able to settle down and harness their attention and their motivation to learn, and as a result, they do better academically. And of course, it helps on the other side too, reducing conduct problems and emotional distress. And these days, emotional distress is something that many of us are facing, but as we know, there's an epidemic of anxiety and depression, not only the result of COVID, but the result of being a teenager in this world. Programs that are effective have these four components. They're sequential. They have activities that are sequenced to teach children in a developmental order. They include active learning, so children are practicing the skills. It's not didactically just telling them about them. It's really having them practice and use them. It's focused on these, where time is focused on these skills and practice of the skills. And it's explicit. We have explicit skills that we think are important to target, because when children have these skills, they show better social and emotional outcomes. There's lots of economic data now by economists, and of course, for policymakers and business leaders, they like that idea. One study by Hank Levin and Clive Belfield in New York and Stanford showed that for every $1 invested, there's an $11 return. I've been involved in a curriculum called the PAS curriculum that's been shown to have about a $22 return for each dollar invested. Now, a lot of focuses in SEL is on programs and curriculum in the classroom that teachers can teach, but there's a big question, and the question is SEL basically a program used by teachers in a classroom? That's a thought that many people have had in the past, but we at CASEL have never believed that. We believe the answer is no. The program is a critical component, as we want to make sure that teachers are using evidence-based programs that we know work. But systems change occurs at many levels, at the level of the classroom, at the level of the school. It has lots of processes, components, and actions. And so I want to talk in a broader way today about that broader aspect of what we call being systemic in social emotional learning. While the programs are a critical component, and lots of evidence to show that, they're only one component of a larger picture. And that larger picture is shown here by what's called the CASEL framework for systemic SEL. You see in the middle the 5 components of social emotional learning I've talked about, and then you see the first blue circle being the classroom instructional and climate practices. Those include the effective SEL curriculums, but also what is classroom climate like? Then there's the broader issue of what's the school-wide culture? both for adults and for children. What are the practices and policies a school puts in place? Do they put in harsh disciplinary programs? Are they doing SEL at the same time they're expelling children on a regular basis? That would not be called a positive school-wide culture. And then there's the issue of reaching out and making sure that we're working effectively with families and caregivers. We're developing authentic partnerships where parents are partners in this process. And then we have the larger issue of aligning learning opportunities with the community. That might be preschool programs for younger children. It might mean after school or out of school programs during the rest of the day. It could be working with other community agencies, sports teams, et cetera, and more broadly with the community from a policy standpoint. How are we going to make our communities places that are caring, loving places where all people feel that they are respected and they belong? That's the big picture. So there's a bunch of components then for systems change. There's obviously evidence-based explicit SEL curricula in the classroom. There's integrating SEL with other curricula, like with literacy or science or math. Very important is a focus on adult SEL. As one superintendent pulled me aside in the bathroom after one meeting, he said to me, the problem is not the kids, it's us. If we get ourselves together and we are able to get along better and demonstrate these skills ourselves and work together as adults in a warm, loving community, that's probably the most important issue that he saw. Of course, we want to focus on a common language that's used all across the school in special classes, on the playground, if you have buses, on the buses or wherever. We want to build climate and culture of the school so that both students and teachers feel they belong to a place that is innovative, caring, and productive. We want to have healthy partnerships with parents. We want to be able to assess these outcomes over time so that we can continuously improve. And those are really important components of systemic change. So Subbu, I don't know if the document that I reviewed in December is being handed out at this conference, but that document talks about Accelerate, the Learning Curve Foundations model, and it has many of these components in it already. And in a sense, the Learning Curve Foundation is very systemic in its conceptual model, and it is very exciting to see that because many times we see only one component, only assessment or only a curriculum. And in the Accelerate model, there's the Lead Well component, which is a framework for teachers and their own development. There's the Ready for the World, the curriculum for students in the classroom. There's the Catalyst framework, which is for the school level practices and policies. There's the Connect work, which is on a framework for working with parents. And there's assessment devices that Subbu Gayatri and the team have developed to look at both the processes and the outcomes across these different levels and across time. So we can assess how we're doing, what we need to improve, and then support those assessments over time to see if improvements are actually happening. Evidence-based outcomes. So I'm interested in creating a caring school and a loving world in the same way that Nemo talked about, but I can't sing like he can. But there's a couple components I think are really important here. The first is that both children and adults need emotion regulation skills. That's the most important thing, is the ability to regulate our emotions effectively. And of course, that has a lot of components inside of it. We have to first be able to recognize our emotions. Not only in order to regulate them. We know that the emotion regulation skills are pretty independent of what we'd call normal cognitive intelligence. You probably know lots of really smart people that don't manage their emotions very well. And you probably know a lot of people that never have finished high school, never finished secondary school, who are loving, caring people that can well regulate their emotions. So we want to make sure that we understand this is not just a matter of cognitive ability. It's much more than that. It's in the heart. And at the level of schools, we need to adapt practices that create shared communities of caring, of healthy norms, and of a safe environment, especially these days when everyone is concerned about the quality of schooling. This can include high quality SEL skills. As I've mentioned, it can include mindfulness skills. I think for teenagers, I have less less hope for the sole use of mindfulness skills for children. I don't think they're going to be terribly effective alone by themselves. I think learning to express caring and gratitude is very important for all of us. And for children as they get older in the secondary schools, service learning to do things that are actively help them support their community and feel the feedback of what it means to do good. But all of this requires one important thing, and that is principal leadership. At the level of the building, the principal is the most important person, and she or he sets the tone for all of these things, for emotion regulation skills, for creating shared communities, for expressing caring and gratitude, for creating a curriculum or supporting a curriculum that can do all this work. And this requires systems planning. And that's why thinking about systemic SEL is important. So in the classroom, we think about it as a three-legged stool. We think that it's very important we have explicit SEL instruction, and the meta-analysis I mentioned earlier illustrates the importance of that. We need a supportive classroom environment, a classroom which supports everyone, is culturally responsive, is developmentally appropriate, is focused on building a sense of a family in the classroom, where children are empowered by shared agreements that they agree to, and it sets a tone of equality in a classroom. And I don't know if you can remember back to classrooms in which your teachers were loving, caring, and great listeners and created a sense of community. I hope you had at least one of those in your childhood, but you can remember lots of classrooms in which that wasn't the case, in which teachers thought that the best way to manage children was to be harsh and to be didactic and controlling. And lastly, we want to integrate SEL with the rest of instruction, and we can do that in every capacity, from health education to literacy to science and math, social studies, etc. Now, there are lots of evidence-based programs. Accelerate through Learning Curve is one example of, I think, a strong conceptual program, but there are many programs that have been carefully tested, and both CASEL has guides that you might be interested in if you're interested in broadly in the field for both childhood, middle, and high school programs. And also there's something in America called the Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development that has very strong criteria for saying that programs actually work. But it's one thing to have a program that looks like it works in a randomized trial, and it's another thing to have a program work in the real world on an everyday basis. And what's most important, not only is that we use explicit curriculum that have those safe criteria, that has evidence of its effectiveness, but we need to understand the right conditions for it to thrive in a school. Because I can tell you, I've seen excellent programs completely fail in the wrong conditions, and that's bad for public policy. So I've learned a lot about this over almost 40 years now of doing these programs and doing them not only in the United States, but in Pakistan and Iran and Australia and China, many different places. And across these many experiences, the first thing that is important is that fidelity matters. And by fidelity, it means really following the program as it was planned. But that does not mean that we don't make changes. We always want to make local changes to fit the culture and the context of a community, of a country, or of just a school building. We know the best outcomes are associated with those practitioners that have high fidelity. They are creative also, of course, in making the right kinds of adaptations, but they keep fidelity to the central and core issues in the curriculum. And that high fidelity results from careful attention to implementation. There is little hope, I must say, almost no hope, that handing teachers a curriculum or giving them an hour or two of training is going to lead to high fidelity. High fidelity means we want to plan systemically. We want to give the right kind of initial training, but we want to give ongoing consultation and technical assistance to teachers and principals, because programs evolve over time, and we always say that the first training should never be the last training. So SEL programs and practices won't grow or germinate in the wrong situation. Training and ongoing support are really critical. teachers' buy-in, knowledge, and skill are essential. So we want to think from the beginning about how we introduce programs and make sure that teachers feel that they are involved in the decision and that they buy into the process, because any kind of change in schools is often traumatic. And lastly, principal leadership is key. So I've been spending a lot of time the last 15 years or so on the teachers themselves, on educators and social emotional learning. And I have to admit, I don't know much about the context in India, except I know that in public schools there are many stresses for teachers, including low salaries, a lot of absenteeism. I'm familiar with the issues that occur. But in most places in the world, and I assume it's the same in India or worse, there is a serious crisis of teacher retention. In the United States, teaching is now rated as the most highly stressful profession, along with nursing. And this was before COVID. We know we need to support teachers' own social emotional learning and their professional growth. Teaching is a profession, just like being a lawyer or a doctor. And if you talk to teachers that have been teaching for 10 or 15 or 20 years, they'll say something like, oh, it wasn't until my 8th year that I really figured out how to be a great teacher. And I'm still learning now. So we need to think about how we create the context for teachers to grow professionally. And part of that is their own social emotional development. So we've been doing work with teachers on their own well-being and how we can support teachers' own SEL and their well-being. We've done 6 randomized trials now that have shown that we can increase teachers' well-being and their enjoyment of teaching. And there's a number of different programs that have been used. So let me start with a poll for you. I can't do actually a real poll today, but I'll ask you these questions and I hope you're saying yes. Are educators with better social and emotional skills more likely to succeed? I hear lots of yeses coming across the screen. Is it important for educators to take time to take care of themselves and to nurture their own well-being? And I hope the answer to that one's yes. And will educators be better prepared for their career and life if their social emotional skills are nurtured throughout their careers, starting in their pre-service and their teacher training? And I hope you would say yes to that. And if that's the case, then how can we do this? How can we, whoops. I think I just lost you. Can you see this? Subbu, are you there?
Mark, yes, we can see you and we can hear you just fine.
Okay, good. Then how can we ensure that educators' social and emotional skills are nurtured throughout their careers? Because we're never going to get to the point where we're going to build systemic SEL and the kind of caring schools that have high expectations for students' achievement at the same time, unless we work on nurturing the development of teachers themselves. And so a colleague of mine, Tish Jennings, and I developed a model called the pro-social classroom. And you can see it on the right end in the green. The outcomes we want are students having positive social and emotional and academic outcomes. And we know that's more likely when we see the purple, that we see healthy classrooms. And that's the result of teachers having positive, loving, caring relationships with students, teachers having good management skills, and teachers effectively implementing social emotional curriculum. But what does that depend on? That depends on the teacher's own social emotional skills and well-being. And you all know yourselves that we have good days and bad days, and when we're not feeling very well, we don't do very well at work, and it's the same for teachers. So over the last 15 years, we've developed and tested a program called Care for Teachers. It's part of the nonprofit I chair called Create for Educators. And this is a program for teachers intending to improve their well-being by increasing their mindfulness, their positive emotion, and their enjoyment and efficacy of teaching, and decreasing their burnout and their negative and depressive affect. Usually it's done as a 3-day model. 2 days of retreat before the school year begins, and a day in the fall, usually a booster in the spring. But because of the pandemic, the program's adapted and it's being taught online to places all over the world in a very different way, of course, through Zoom. There are three main program elements we found are really important for teachers. One is to teach them some mindfulness practices, but that does not mean that we expect teachers to sit on a pillow for 10 or 20 minutes or a half hour. Instead, we teach them very simple practices that are in the moment. Deep breathing, how to set an intention, how to be centered in the classroom, how to have a presence and walk mindfully. We teach them a lot about emotional awareness and their own triggers for emotions with children in the classroom that deal with anger and fear, sadness. And then we teach them some mindfulness skills, if you want to think about them, as empathy and compassion training. We call it a caring practice. And lastly, we teach them mindful listening, how to really deeply listen from the heart instead of listening in order that you can respond by giving a solution. We've done this in multiple studies in rural and urban America, in the Bronx, in New York City, in Zagreb, in Croatia. And in all three randomized trials, we see the same kinds of positive effects, that it lowers teachers' perceptions of their own stresses. It increases their efficacy in teaching. They feel less rushed. They have less time urgency, in spite of the fact that we've done nothing to change their schedule, their daily schedule. We see lower rates of depression and anxiety, them reporting greater compassion for both themselves and others. And we've seen lower rates of physical symptoms of stress, because we know that stress gets under the skin and affects health. And lastly, in a large study in New York, we've actually observed the teaching in 225 classrooms before and afterwards, and showed that it improved the quality of teachers' actual pedagogy. We've actually followed up the New York teachers a year later, so 1.5 years after they've done the training, and we still see continued benefits in reductions in psychological stress, improvements in their own sense of mindfulness, and in their ability to adaptively regulate emotions. So I think there's a really important investment that we should consider in thinking about how we deeply support teachers. And that doesn't mean that that we want to victimize teachers. That is, teachers are not the problem in that sense. I don't want to get the wrong idea. The problem is not the teachers, it's our system. And the changes in systemic SEL are important. But one change that supports teachers is by helping them build their own awareness. Leadership is also a big issue, and we've done the same kind of work now with head teachers and principals, different places around the world. And we can say the same thing about a model for principals. We have a student outcomes again in green on the right. We want to have a healthy school climate, not just a healthy classroom climate. And that has to do with healthy principal and staff relationships, a healthy organizational culture in the school, effective principal community relationships. And what does it depend on? It depends on what's in the dark blue on the left. And that's the principal's own social and emotional skills and well-being. If we don't have people that are well in leadership positions, and we don't have people that are well in the classroom, how are we going to build the kind of community and society that we're focused on as a goal? So this principle says, my survival kit, it's a meditation tape, aspirin, and rose-colored glasses. And surely that is not enough to help principals survive. And in the US and other countries, I don't know research in India, there's even more turnover at the level of head teachers or principals than there is in the classroom teachers, because principals often find this job so stressful, a 24/7 job that's very lonely. So how do we become more systematic in our thinking? There's lots of ways to do this. As a founder of CASEL, I'll tell you just a little bit. There's a school guide that's free at schoolguidecasel.org, which is a guide on how a school can formulate a team that can move forward to do that. The goal is to provide recommendations and tools to help schools achieve that systemic approach to school-wide SEL, coordinating classroom, school, home, and community. And it's written for teams. So schools develop school-based teams. They have teachers, maybe support teachers, possibly parents. And then they move forward using that guide through the steps of building systemic SEL. And they do that by a variety of ways, including building awareness, commitment, and ownership in their building with their teachers, helping the school establish a shared vision and plan, cultivating adult SEL, promoting evidence-based curricula in the classroom, and using data for continuous improvement. And I would say this pretty much captures what the Learning Curve Foundation has been doing on its own. We talk about 10 indicators of making systemic SEL, or what we call school-wide SEL. You've seen me already mention a number of these: explicit SEL, integration. One I haven't mentioned yet is youth voice and engagement, and this becomes particularly important by the time children are entering secondary school. Supportive discipline is important. What is the standard and style of discipline? Is it one that's restorative and helps children to repair the damage they've done, or is it just punishment? We want to integrate supports across a continuum for children that have more serious mental health problems. And as you can see, the other things I've mentioned: family partnerships, community partnerships, and data for continuous improvement. When we have all these things in place, to some degree at least, we're not going to get them all in place. It's a process over time. But we can go through a rubric right now in our schools, and we can think, have we started on each of these? Have we made any progress? What's the next step? And continue to use a continuous improvement system to monitor how well we can improve in each of these 10 indicators. But this takes time. I think it takes 3 to 6 years between exploring, starting to install some of these ideas, doing some initial implementation and getting feedback from your data, all kinds of data, to see what needs to be changed, moving to full implementation and sustainability. It's a process over time. People want a quick fix. They would like to see a curriculum that they can install tomorrow with 1 hour of Zoom training, and this is going to solve the problem. But we know from experience all over the world that this is not the solution. The solution is to think more broadly, more deeply, and more long-term. So what are the implications for practice and policy as I wrap up? Social emotional learning works. It includes positive outcomes, including achievement outcomes, and that's important from a policy standpoint in terms of what state governments want. It has outcomes that are true across grades and across contexts in very different kinds of schools. It's doable. Well-trained teachers show strong outcomes. And teachers want SEL. You might be interested in Googling at some time the missing piece, which is a survey of teachers in the US, but teachers in other countries say the same thing. They want the skills to build the kinds of caring classrooms that encourage achievement. And SEL is a good economic investment, and that's one reason why it's grown so much in many countries in the last few years. But it needs support. It requires strong leadership and quality professional development. It needs effective planning to lead to effective implementation, and requires greater support by both federal and state policies. And I'm sure in India, you have the same issues of both at the federal level and at the state level of how you get policymakers to see this as critical and essential as a part of schooling. So just to end with a vision of social emotional learning for our classroom, our school, our province, our nation, our world. The vision is educators, students, families, and community members work together to support healthy development for all children. All children are engaged and active learners who are self-aware, caring, respectful, good decision makers. And students are contributing in positive ways to their schools and communities, because in the end, the goal is to build strong citizenship in an active democracy. And if anything that points to the need for this, it's what's happened in the United States just in the last few days. That democracy is fragile, that caring for others that are different than you is fragile, and we need to make sure we build the kinds of citizens that have the skills to appreciate, respect, and honor all people. So just to end with a holistic picture, some people think that this problem is just about social emotional skill development, but it's not. It's about creating these effective conditions for learning and norms of caring, and we can't leave out teacher and administrator well-being and awareness. It's when we have these three things together that we begin to build a kind of holistic, caring, systemic school that I think everyone yearns for. So there's a couple essential questions every community, I think, has to answer that will lead them, I think, to this place. What do we want our children to become, to know, and to be able to do when they graduate? And how can the entire community be organized to ensure that all students reach those goals? So I'll end here with keeping calm and showing compassion, especially in these deep, dark periods that we're experiencing around the world with COVID and other issues. And Subbu, if we have time for some questions, I'd love to, or just thoughts, I'd love to discuss them.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Yes, we do have time for questions. We have about 5-7 minutes easily for questions. I think I can see a question come up on my panel here. So I request the audience, if you have a question, you could sort of. So there's one question that Asha has asked. I'll just read out the question for you, Mark. How does SEL integrated in curriculum bring in more benefits than just standalone SEL curriculum?
Well, I think first of all, it's very important, especially in the elementary school years, to have standalone curriculum, because there are skills that need to be taught, just like we teach skills in reading or in math. There are social emotional skills that we know need to be taught explicitly, and we need to be covered in a developmental order. At the same time, it's important to integrate that too, because we don't want teachers to teach SEL as if it's one chunk of the day, and then when they get to reading stories, for example, they don't explore what's most important in those stories, which is how people felt, what their goals were, how they faced conflict, and how they resolved it. Or let's think about social studies. Let's think about what's going on politically in India, or think about what's going on in the United States right now, or any country. What's happening? What are the perspectives of people that feel differently? Why do they feel that way? How do we go about learning how to resolve conflict with people that are different? How do we learn to respect people that have very different views than our own? That is something we are integrated in social studies. A wonderful example of that is a middle school curriculum called Facing History and Ourselves, which explores the Holocaust, the Civil Rights Movement, and other issues in which children learn about the different perspectives that occurred in those historic events, and then they think about how it relates to their daily life in their own neighborhood and community. Climate change is a perfect example. I've been working with international baccalaureate schools on systems thinking and climate and compassion. How do we think about the problem? Let's take an example of a problem that the high school students might deal with, which is water. Water is a concern. People talk about it as the new gold, and water is something that's we're going to need to do a much better job of conserving in order to survive, and having children explore all the aspects of water, where it comes from, how it's used, how we can change that use, and doing that from a point of compassion and understanding all the perspectives in the situation is a perfect example of doing social emotional learning, but doing it in a science curriculum. So while we need explicit skills, and those are true also in high school. So for example, we know that there's way too much sexual violence going on in our high schools. And I know that's been an issue in India. It's an issue everywhere in the world. How do we help students in the 14 to 16, 18-year-old range learn how to carry on the relationships without violence, with love and caring? So explicit SEL skills, as Oscar Wilde once said, only the naive know themselves. And that is until our last day on this earth. We will still be working on our own social and emotional development. And there are skills for us to learn and practice and do better at, all of us, throughout our lives. And so while we can integrate it in some areas, we also want to think about these explicit skills at each age that are most developmentally appropriate.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for answering that question. I had a couple more questions here. I'm just going to pick one. Shweta, I know you're here from Key Ed, and you could have posted a question there. If you want to ask that question directly to Mark, if you can just use the raise hand feature, I can hand you a mic, and you can actually ask that question directly if you want to do that. If it's not too much trouble. There we go. I have a raised hand. And Shweta, I'm handing you the mic now.
Hi, I'm assuming I'm audible. Yes.
Yes, very,
Hi.
very on. Go for it.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for shedding light on just taking a systemic lens to this. I know I've had multiple conversations with everybody just saying, how do we look at it as a system, everybody, and especially look at educators and school leadership when we talk about SEL. So I think today was very enlightening. Not to take up too much time, so I had a quick question more around. I work in the early years with 3 to 6 year old children, and we've been keenly looking at what SEL can be for them. And I've gone back and forth on my personal opinions on bringing in context when we talk about curriculum for explicit instruction of social and emotional development skills for the early years. So I just wanted to know your take on how important it is for us to create contextual curriculum in terms of language, the experiences of the children in the early years, versus picking up really high quality, excellent curriculum that has been created, but probably not with context, an Indian context primarily in mind.
Well, I think that in the Indian context, any cultural context is important, and I know that if I'm in Tamil Nadu, it's going to be very different than I'm in Uttar Pradesh. So that I know that India, like America, is a very diverse country with not only language but cultural differences that are very important to respect. So any curriculum that we would use, even if it's developed in Delhi, is going to look different when it's in than Chennai than when it's in Goa. And so any curriculum is going to need contextual adaptation, even if it's Indian. Now, saying that, I think that there is some value in developing curricula in each country. But what we'll see, and I think we can see that in the curriculum, for example, developed by Learning Curve, that I would say that 90% of what's in that curriculum is culturally consistent across any culture, because it's about the developmental process of how the brain is organized. And I didn't talk about neuroscience today, but how we acquire these skills. Now, how important, for example, language is in early childhood. And there's lots of good evidence to show that that if we compare just a really good early childhood class to a really early good childhood class that adopts an SEL curriculum that's well done, that we'll see more improvements in children's outcomes when that SEL curriculum is added. And my colleagues, for example, have just published a study which was on low-income American children in Head Start. Head Start's a very good program, but they included an SEL curriculum integrated with pre-literacy, and they've now just published an article which is 12 years later, when the children are almost graduating from high school, showing there are still effects of having that preschool curricula, of teaching those explicit skills all the way through high school. Great question.
Thank you so much for that.
I think we have time for maybe one more. There are a couple of interesting questions here. So this is a question from Jyoti Ravichandran from Thrive Foundation. Jyoti, I don't know if you're in the audience. I'm going to read the question out very quickly. CASEL published a study reporting that about 85% of school leaders and teachers believe that SEL is important. Jyoti is asking what reasons may be there for the other 15 or so who may not have considered important, and are there any lessons for folks working here in India?
So it's a really good question. It does show, of course, that most people feel it is, and what you see is that the percentage of leaders, principals who don't think it's very important are almost always at the high school level. And I don't know if you know how high schools are organized in America, but I think it's somewhat similar, but a bit different than in India. They are very driven by achievement tests. Teachers work in departments. So instead of in elementary schools, teachers work at a grade level where all the teachers in the same grade work together. They know all the kids really well because they're with them most of the day, and they really develop relationships. But in high schools, kids move from class to class. And the science teachers spend time with science teachers, and the math teachers spend time with math teachers. They think about themselves as departmental specialists. And when that happens, there's no systemic SEL going on in the school, because the whole child is not being considered as the unit of education. And it's usually in the high school conditions in which we see principals saying it's not very important. And I think one reason is because they don't know how to even begin. They don't know how to begin to do this. And we don't have many very good models of how this is done still in secondary conditions. Excellent question. And it's a big challenge. We know that SEL is much easier to do, not necessarily more effective, but easier to do in the kindergartens and in the elementary schools. And as we get to junior high or middle school, as we call it, it's a little bit more difficult. And in high schools, it gets more complicated.
Great, thank you, Mark, for answering that question. We're kind of short on time, so maybe a good idea to sort of close the session. But what I think a couple of things that really stood out for me, Mark, I think is one where you said, that it's not the kids, it's the adults who are the problem. I think we do need to look at that, and the other points that you really made about the fact that individual components by themselves may not really be as effective in solving a larger problem. And it's like almost saying the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that's really the view that you gave us today, and that's I think really important for almost any education system around the world, and more so for India, I would like to think. So thank you, Mark, for those great insights today. Really grateful that you took the time. I know it's late. So but thanks for that anyway.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you all. I wish it was face to face, and I'm excited that you'll hear from Molly next, who has got wonderful experience in doing this kind of work.